Chapter 61. A whole new version you have never played before. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. After the players relaxed through the festival, Shi Wei immediately returned to his divine kingdom to resume his plans of upgrading his divinity. Under his continued efforts, most of the Rotten Bones god's divinity had already been absorbed by Shi Wei. Using this energy obtained, Shi Wei repaired his own divinity, and even had enough to spare to make a new appearance for himself. But after calculating the divine energy he would need to do so, Shi Wei gave up on the chance to release himself from his spherical form. It's fine to be a sphere, I have tentacles anyway, so there's nothing inconvenient about it. After absorbing all the divinity fragments and energy, the other remaining components of the Rotten Bones god wasn't valuable to Shi Wei anymore. The remains and body parts could be used to make godly items, but he would have to remove the deific properties attached to it. Once a deity's divinity was destroyed and their consciousness wiped, their body would be able to move instinctively due to the deific properties left on it. Shi Wei could use lots of time and energy to absorb the deific properties of the remains into his own divinity to make himself become the god of games and rotten bones, thus becoming a lesser god. The concept of composite divinities sounded cool in theory, but it actually didn't have much use in reality. Shi Wei even had the premonition that if he was greedy for that bit of deific properties, it would probably pollute his own gaming divinity and make it even weaker, perhaps even putting obstacles in his own plans to develop his believers, so it wasn't worth it. To take an example, a transmigrator would need the memories of the ones they transmigrated onto, but not their original personality and thoughts. He had obtained traces of the Rotten Bones divinity anyway, so it was alright to throw away the deific properties left on its corpse. And so, Shi Wei created something like a juice blender and named it the Mound of the Bound Creator, one before throwing the corpse of the Rotten Bones god into it. Inside the Mound of the Bound Creator was a miniature and strong closed space, and even the body of a deity couldn't get out of it. In this space, there was a single, pinprick small opening. Just like a bee that can find the exit point when it's trapped in a bottle, the deific properties of the Rotten Bones god would instinctively try to escape from the Mound of the Bound Creator through the minuscule exit. And so, the corpse of the Rotten Bones god would remain in the Mound of the Bound Creator while its deific properties would flow out bit by bit through the exit that Shi Wei had prepared. Of course, Shi Wei had no plans on wasting the deific properties, already making preparations on how to utilize it. Actually, the Mound of the Bound Creator was connected to the Rotten Bones divine kingdom that had already been taken over by Shi Wei. After the Rotten Bones god died, said divine kingdom had degraded into a bunch of spatial fragments. If it weren't for Shi Wei maintaining its existence, it would have probably disappeared into the void. Shi Wei used his divine energy to split the Rotten Bones divine kingdom into many separate spaces, and placed the remains of the skeletons, hogwash rats and other monsters that the players had sacrificed to him, which had already flooded Shi Wei's divine kingdom. He didn't even have the chance to convert them into game coins, because the players had enough for the time being. Regular beings from the mortal realm couldn't contain deific properties, but because the deific properties that trickled out of the Mound of the Bound Creator was very little, and was just enough to attach onto every corpse and make them reanimate with greater power than a regular revenant. Once every corpse was reanimated, the hole in the Mound of the Bound Creator would automatically close. This was a real dungeon that Shi Wei had prepared for the players. In comparison, the Valley of the Tragic Dead was just an exploration dungeon that would only give limited rewards to the players unless they explored new territory. According to the ratio that the deific properties attached onto the corpses, the abilities and powers of the mobs created would be quite great too. For example, the challenge level for a hogwash rat was level 1, meaning that even a level 1 player would be able to fight evenly with this monster that was attached with deific properties, while the challenge level of the corpses of the believers was at least level 15. Meanwhile, the body of the Archbishop of the Rotten Bones Church had already become a level 30 mini-boss. Of course, it wasn't as strong as when it was alive, but there were only a few players that could beat him even in this state, anyway. Because every monster in every space was different and randomized, so there was a chance that the players would meet the Rotten Bones Archbishop immediately upon entering the dungeon. After the monsters were defeated, the corpses wouldn't disappear while the deific properties would be sacrificed to him. After the deific properties of the Rotten Bones god was sacrificed to Shi Wei in this way, it would be filtered and purified, and become pure divine energy that Shi Wei could absorb without fear of polluting his divinity. Since the dungeon needs maintenance and to prevent them from not going out to battle other monsters, I would have to limit the amount of times they can challenge the dungeon. Since there are 36 spaces, I'll open the 72 challenges per day. Shi Wei calculated for a bit, and discovered that if he did so the deific properties from the Rotten Bones god would be able to keep up for around half a year. He was quite satisfied with this number because there were a lot of evil deities in the world, and he would probably find a good replacement in 6 months. The investment he put into designing this dungeon was quite a lot, however, and just the amount required to redesign the Rotten Bones Divine Kingdom and create the Mound of the Bound Creator was around 90% of all his divine energy. Because he had to reserve some divine energy to deal with sudden emergencies, he didn't have enough to create the player internet that he had wanted to create. Also there's the changes that don't require much divine energy to create. Like the player's level cap, and new class changes and such. These parts were quite easy to do, because his own divinity had leveled up after absorbing the fragments of the Rotten Bones god's divinity. The level cap of the players could be seen as a limiter to prevent players from becoming too strong, and could be controlled by him. Now that he himself was stronger, the limiter could of course be increased. Then, he used his tentacles to type out a bunch of data on the god computer that he created, and after checking that nothing was wrong, Shi Wei sent the changes and updates to the players other than the ones that had management.type systems like Angora. Ding! Game version 0.1 updated. Chapter 62. New classes. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. The next day after the festival, the players had barely woken up from their hangovers and were about to start working, before they accepted the system notification that Shi Wei had sent them. Ding! Game version 0.1 update complete. New dungeon added. Cellar of the Living Dead, LV1 LV30, Dungeon Description. The believers of the Rotten Bones have successfully been dispelled back into the darkness from whence they came by the brave heroes of the Church of the God of Games, but they have received power from the evil deity and are plotting from the darkness. They have completely thrown away their last vestiges of pride as humans, and have turned into revenants that are lying in wait for a chance to strike, bringing unimaginable chaos and death to the world. The great and unbelievably wise God of Games has intercepted this plot, and had locked them in a spatial cellar. Now, you must purify them and send them all back into the depths of hell. Dungeon details. Only the players of the unnamed town and the underground hideout of Lancaster that have at least friendly reputation can buy a cellar key, consumable, teleportation item, from Angora Faust/Leah Yakaran by using game coins or by completing quests. Each key can bring 6 players into the Cellar of the Living Dead, and 70.2 can be used per day. Dungeon clear requirements. Defeat all the enemies in the cellar for a chance to obtain elite or even legendary items hidden in its depths. Note. Good luck. God of Games, the first matter notified to all the players had already made them become excited. No player had ever obtained legendary items before, so the appearance of this dungeon served as motivation for the players to work harder. As for the 72 keys per day, the players didn't care much about it. After all, they had the experience of scavenging and pioneering the Valley of the Tragic Dead, so they would need to have a full party to have a good chance at attempting this dungeon. Under the restriction of everyone being able to challenge the dungeon once, there were only enough players to make around 20 to 30 groups. At this point in time, 70.2 keys were more than enough. The players had thought that the new dungeon was the greatest update this time around, but the following messages were the actual bombs of this update. Player level cap increased to level 45, new class. Spirit Swordsman, class introduction, spirit swordsmen use mysterious rituals to tame evil spirits from the netherworld, and develop them into strong familiar spirits by leveling up and learning skills. Click to view demonstration video, class change requirements. Level 15 warriors can change into this class upon accomplishing a special mission. The video that was attached was a game CG created by Shiwei. It roughly showed off the traits of the Spirit Swordsman class. First of all, developing a familiar spirit is not without its disadvantages. The familiar spirit would take over a quarter of the player's HP gauge, so Spirit Swordsmen only had 75% of their original HP. At the same time, players would have to sacrifice a portion of their EXP to the familiar spirit, meaning that the EXP they would be able to obtain from defeating a monster would be decreased. Of course, in exchange for the large sacrifice required, a familiar spirit's help towards a player would be extremely great too. There were 3 skill trees that a spirit swordsman could develop in: Soul Manipulation, Evil Blade, and Spirit Array. Soul Manipulation was focused on controlling spirits to fight against enemies directly, and players that focus on this skill tree could basically be regarded as 2 combatants. Because they can communicate and share their senses with their familiar spirit, they can experience twice the happiness of battling, of course, twice the pain too. Players that choose the Evil Blade skill tree could imbue their weapons with their familiar spirit, and under this condition they could have additional bonuses to their swordsmanship, and according to the different types of familiar spirits, even if it were the same sword skill, it could be completely different. Finally, players that choose the Spirit Array skill tree would develop multiple familiar spirits. Sacrificing their mobility and battle prowess, they would obtain the ability to cast strong AoE buffs and debuffs. It was kind of like the Soul Bender class in Dungeon Fighter Online, but the many spirit arrays look flashier. New class. Shadow Rogue, class introduction. Shadow Rogues have given up on the bow and arrow, choosing to hide in the shadows for the best chance to strike and assassinate their enemies. They pride themselves on their assassination abilities and grasp on poisons, and can even employ curses and voodoo when faced directly. Don't underestimate them. Click to view demonstration video, class change requirements. Level 15 Rangers can change into this class upon accomplishing a special mission. In comparison to the flashy Spirit Swordsman, Shadow Rogue skills were much more discreet and simple. Even if there was the existence of the game system, an assassin couldn't use a large-scale and flashy skill with extravagant special effects to defeat their enemies. If Shiwei designed the class like that, then players who wanted to become assassins could only go with the somewhat comedic route of, if I kill anyone who sees me, then I'll succeed in subterfuge and assassination. Even so, this new class didn't disappoint the players at all. Firstly, there was the Dark Blade skill tree that allowed them to sneak around more stealthily, as well as giving them a lot of movement skills. Then, there was the Poisoneer skill tree that would give them the ability to kill enemies with terrible poisons and alchemical weapons. Finally, there was the Voodoo skill tree that lets players curse their enemies and debuff them before executing them. Even though I say that I envy you guys, I really, truly, envy you. After he looked through the system update, he couldn't help but look at Joe, who was smiling happily, and Dan, who furrowed his brow. Why isn't there a class change for the mage class? Does the god of games dislike us? It was now that Edward knew what the fifth doctrine meant when it said that strength completely depends on the current version. Never blame yourself for the path you have chosen. If you want to blame someone, then blame the cursed game designers. He was once confused about why the god of games expected they would curse their own path after being gifted with such a system that rewarded every effort, but now that it happened that his comrades got to become stronger while he didn't, it was quite hard not to be envious. Chapter 63. Title Flat Exploration. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. When everyone was getting ready to challenge the new dungeon, Edward's party, who were part of the pioneer team, were on a tidal flat nearby, their steps leaving footprints on the damp sand. This place was very close to the sea, and accompanying the slightly fishy smell of the sea were the sound of waves, and the chirping seabirds were quite loud too. That being said, the sounds coupled with the scenery of the vast sea and sky made the entire image complete. Other than the five in Edward's party, Vela, who was Angora's right-hand woman, tagged along with them this time. In this world, other than when it was absolutely necessary, most people wouldn't travel by sea, or even go near to the sea at all. The reason was simple: there were many times more monsters in the sea than on land, and even near the shore. Even if someone was walking on the land by the shore, it would be easy to get attacked by amphibious monsters. Like now, for example, when a monster that looked like an Anomalocaris with a shell that resembled armor jumped out from the sea and attacked the party. As the cream of the crop among all the players, the party reacted quite quickly and got into formation. Joe, who had class changed into a spirit swordsman, blocked the monster. Edward, Go-Dan, and Vela were in charge of attacking and kiting, while Alina and Jessica were in charge of healing and buffs. After a short while, the sea monster wailed in pain as it dropped dead, disappearing into the sand after leaving behind two forelegs that looked like saws. Joe had barely gotten hurt and had snatched the final strike on the monster, his eyes practically sparkling with glee. This class is so awesome. As the first player that had successfully class changed into a spirit swordsman, so he was still experimenting with his skills, but even with the simple help of the familiar spirit, it already had significantly impacted his battle style. Like the sea monster from earlier, if he was still in his earlier class, he would definitely have lost at least a third of his HP from tanking the hits for so long. After getting the familiar spirit that could tank and attract aggro for him, he could exchange the target of the enemy between him and the familiar spirit to break its combos and prevent them from getting in all the damage. Not only was it easier to tank damage and defend his allies, but he would also get to damage the enemy even more. In terms of overall contribution, his damage was only lower than Edward, who focused on attacking, and this was after he had been focusing almost completely on defense, and only started attacking with Evil Blade mode at the last minute. It seemed that if a spirit swordsman completely went with the skill tree of the Evil Blade, it would definitely have the highest attacking power in this update. So class change seems much stronger than regular classes. Why didn't you class change into a shadow rogue, Mr. Doug? After she saw Joe's performance in battle, Vela asked the other person who had qualifications to class change in the party. You're level 15, unlike me who's just level 10, right? Ahaha, that I wonder why. I actually don't know myself. Go-Dan scratched at the back of his head sheepishly. Don't listen to him. The only reason why he didn't class change was because he didn't want the archery that his dad taught him to be lost in his hands. Edward started chewing his own party member out. Only because shadow rogues can't use bows and arrows. Leader, why are you like this? Go-Dan groaned. Does it make you happy by embarrassing me? Yes, it makes me very happy. Look, mages don't even have a chance to class change and can just eat sourbu fruit, a fruit like a lemon, at a side in envy. You have the chance to class change, but you gave it up, so of course I don't feel happy about it. Edward replied directly, before advising, the chance to grow stronger is right in front of you, so don't give up, don't you ever stop. 1 inch, what are you saying, leader? I think that the god of games has his own meticulous plans for not directly class changing us after we're high leveled enough. Perhaps rangers can even class change into other classes that are focused on archery in the future. Go-Dan guessed. Or else it wouldn't be rational for rangers to be able to do archery in the first place, so he must be planning something for us. Did you think of this by yourself? Edward asked, his brow furrowed. No, it's just that a lot of the other rangers plan to give it a moment before class changing too, without changing right away. Edward seemed to want to retort even further, but Vela didn't plan to let the party start fighting over this, so she spoke up to cut them off beforehand. Not that I'm displeased about it, but is it alright to let such a young child join us? Vela looked at the silver-haired girl who was happily licking a lollipop and asked worriedly. Feeling Vela's gaze on her, Elena hid her packet of sweets and candies and gazed at her warily, not planning to share the candy that she had received from Shi Wei. Edward set aside his confusion after hearing her question and decided to ask the Archbishop Shi Wei about it the next time they met. He rubbed his cheeks that had become a little stiff from the sea breeze, before smiling. Not even him, but Zhou Godan and Jessica all smiled, as if Vela was telling a joke. Don't judge a book by its cover, Ms. Vela. If it were just in terms of battle power, she's probably the strongest of us all. Edward reassured. Are you joking? Vela evidently didn't believe in what Edward said. To this, Edward shrugged nonchalantly, almost rolling his eyes at Vela. If you don't believe in our strength, why did you ask us to help you with this quest in the first place? Wouldn't it be good to ask Mr. Marnie and Mr. Ivan, or even Princess Leah's party? Jessica didn't want things to get awkward between them, so she tried to redirect the conversation. Mr. Marnie has been helping Lord Angora build and expand the merchant roads of the town, so he didn't have any time to do this mission. Princess Leah, on the other hand, was quite keen on doing this quest, but as soon as she went, my loyal followers, it is time to expand Tierra and make history, Elder Venk dragged her away with an exasperated expression. Hearing her words, Zhou and Godan's expression crumpled. So it wasn't because she believed in them, but because she had no one else to ask. Suddenly, Elena stopped in her steps. Edward was about to ask why she did so, before his own expression turned serious, raising his hand to stop Vela who was about to speak, and whispered with a voice that only the party could hear. We've been surrounded. Chapter 64. Frogman Tribe. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. After they realized that they were surrounded, they all stopped and looked around warily. They were all quite experienced in being surrounded as they had explored a lot in the Valley of the Tragic Dead, and the most monsters there were hordes upon hordes of skeletons and monsters that surrounded players within moments. Of course, the situation right now was different. After all, revenants and undead monsters only acted on their instincts, and the surrounding was only because there were a lot of them. Now, the enemies were surrounding them with a plan and an objective. As the perimeter of the circle of enemies closed in, they saw who exactly was attacking them. These were creatures that were around 1.1–1.2 meters tall, and looked like large toads that stood on 2 feet. Their necks were non-existent and their skin was damp and green or brown, with black stripes and patterns on their skin. They wore clothes made from shells that covered their vitals, while they held easy weapons made from large conches attached to tips of wooden rods. From the way they were puffing their cheeks, it was easy to see that they weren't happy at all. Why are you here, dry-skinned? A large frog with a necklace of shells shouted, and it seemed like he was the leader of the team. It spoke Shumonian, human common language, with a heavy accent. Get out of here, the warty tidal flat belongs to us, the wet-skinned. The ones that called themselves the sticky-skinned were naturally the Frogman tribe that Vela wanted to meet. For context, the name of dry-skinned was a slightly derogatory term that frogmen called everyone other than their own tribe and aquatic tribes. Wow, they're all yellow named, and don't have HP bars. So are they friends, or enemies? Godan muttered softly. No idea, probably neutral. Edward shrugged. We don't want to fight with you, in fact, we're here to help you. Vela shouted out, and to increase her persuasiveness, she threw her bow and dagger onto the ground, and raised both arms in surrender. We just want to talk with the leader of your tribe. After she said so, she looked at the others in the party, gesturing for them to throw down their weapons too. With a sigh, Edward and the other members complied, placing their weapons down on the ground. Different than the regular warriors and mages in this world, players could still use a majority of their abilities, just without the stat boosts given by the equipment. But the frogmen didn't know this, so seeing that the players had thrown their equipment down, their hostility decreased considerably. We don't have anything to say to you dry-skinned people. Catch them all. Remember that the one that caught you was Krakatoa, the hero of the wet-skinned. That frogman sneered at Vela and the party and ordered his subordinates, puffing his cheeks in pride. Hey, that's my T2 great sword from the Valley of the Tragic Dead, don't drag it on the ground. What if you break it? Joe grumbled, but was ignored duly by the frogmen. This weapon was way too heavy for them after all, so dragging it on the ground was all they could do. Under the party's cooperation, they were brought back to the frogman settlement with strips of kelp wrapped around their wrists. Being calm as they were walking, Vela tried to communicate with the other frogmen, but they didn't know how to speak Shimonian. The village was built just by the tidal flat, and there weren't a lot of houses built. Most of the houses were large, 2-meter tall conches, while a small percentage of them were houses built from rocks and shells. Even though it could be considered exotic, the beauty standards of the Frogman tribe differed a lot from that of humans, and standing on the roads of the Frogman village, the party couldn't help feeling that it was extremely filthy. Even if it were still low tide at the moment, the seawater still covered their ankles. This is my first time seeing Frogman buildings. Dan looked around curiously. That goes for all of the human race, too. If there was a ranking of the most mysterious races in the world, Frogmen would definitely rank in the top 10. Vela whispered back to him. Other than some sailors, humans didn't have much interaction with Frogmen. Most of the time, Frogmen would avoid humans and stayed in remote and isolated places, so it was hard to see them. At the same time, Frogmen didn't have anything that warranted the attention of humans. Their flesh tastes gross, their organs don't have any medicinal properties, and they didn't have any valuable local products like pearls. The most valuable things they produced were probably the salted fish that were dried on their roofs. And so after the war, the human civilization didn't have much conflict with Frogmen at all. This was why Angora was curious why the Society of the Secret Eye got into trouble with the Frogman tribe, and why the Frogman tribe would rather fight with them instead of leaving the tidal flats. Also, he wanted to give the Frogmen some help, so that the Society of the Secret Eye didn't attack the unnamed town from the direction of the tidal flats. Here is where the village elder lives, tell him anything. Krakatoa croaked and brought the party to the largest conch in the village. You said you don't have anything to say to us, but you still brought us here anyway. You're a good guy, Krakatoa. Joe was a warrior and a straightforward person, so he laughed and praised the frogman. I just wanted to see what you had to say. The inside of the conch was unexpectedly spacious, and the village elder was already waiting inside. He had yellowish-orange skin that was different than every other frogman in the village, and his size was much larger too, with a bunch of gross-looking warts on his back. According to Krakatoa, you have something to tell me. The frogman asked in fluent Shimonian. I don't think I would be able to help you. Please don't treat us as enemies, we're here to help you. Vela tried to put on a diplomatic front. I believe you have been attacked by other humans recently. Did you dry-skins do it? Vela hadn't finished her sentence before Krakatoa jumped and shouted at her. Krakatoa, you go out first. The village elder made Krakatoa retreat, before turning back to Vela. I apologize for his rudeness, but I hope you understand. You dry-skinned all look the same, and it's really hard to differentiate among you people. Meanwhile, us the wet-skin tribe have many different skin colors and patterns on our skin. Look at this chrysanthemum on my back. Sorry elder, you know that I have always been proud of my cute little chrysanthemum. Krakatoa was bragging about his pattern, before realizing that everyone in the room was looking at him, and so he shrank into a corner. Chapter 65. The player's negotiation strategy is the best in the world. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. After Krakatoa shrank in the corner, everyone in the conch house returned to the topic. Since you talked about the dry-skin that attacked us, then you should know something, right? The village elder asked, his cheeks puffed as he stared straight at Vela. Those people that attacked you are the bandits of the Society of the Secret Eye. They found a sea route, and want to conquer this tidal flat to change it into a harbor to allow them to smuggle their way to the western continent. It wasn't classified information in the first place, so she told the elder the information about the enemy. We are the adventurers from the town outside the Valley of the Tragic Dead. We've had some small conflicts with the Society of the Secret Eye too, so we can help you. It isn't like you dry-skinned to be so generous. The village elder didn't rush to agree or decline, seeming to understand the psychology of humans quite well. He didn't believe that Vela and party would help them battle against their own race for some small conflicts. It was true that in this era before education was widely spread, most humans didn't have the ability to see the big picture and acted mostly on their urges. And so, most demi-human races looked at humans as the most selfish and greedy race in the world. This was a world led by deities and gods after all, and leaving aside the deities that weren't bound by mortal laws, most church leaders like popes and archbishops as well as the monarchy that were at the top of the pyramid didn't want any insurgents popping out from the commoners that could affect their rule. And so, they all worked together to restrict education and make the commoners foolish and easy to control. This was also the reason why in a world of magic and divine arts, with much greater development potential than Earth would maintain in such a medieval era after so many years. As Vela was thinking about how to make the frogmen trust her, Joe, who had been sitting on the floor until his legs were numb, shouted indignantly. "Enough of all this chat, just say what we have to do for you to believe us. Is it enough if I kill myself for the cause? Heh, you're just a cowardly dry-skinned, you wouldn't kill yourself." Krakatoa, who was picking at his toenails with a conch spear at his side, croaked and laughed out. Hearing the frogman say this, Joe jumped up from the floor, and ignoring the kelp around his wrists, he ran over to Krakatoa and snatched away his conch spear. Krakatoa was so terrified that his deep green skin became pale, but his first reaction was to block the village elder from any harm. Contrary to his expectations, Joe didn't attack Krakatoa or the village elder, instead stabbing the conch spear into his chest without any hesitation, spurting out blood from his mouth as he scoffed. "This is nothing. I'll die for you right now." After he said this, he pulled out the spear and blood spurted out from his wound like a fountain, splashing all over the place. The extremely gruesome scene even scared the two frogman guards next to him. Not only the young frogman guards, but even the village elder that had lived an extremely long life was shocked by this action of his. Since when did humans become such a courageous race? Everyone in the room waited for a while to realize that Joe still hadn't died, and his wounds even seemed to be closing up and healing. F***ck, my HP is too high, Lemmy. Joe realized the reason why he hadn't died yet. Even though he impaled his heart, this attack of his that would have definitely killed a regular person didn't make him die under the protection of the laws of the game system. Even though it was a critical hit because it hit his vitals, he still had a lot of HP left. And so, under the petrified gaze of the two frogmen, he cursed and attacked himself with the spear again, spearing himself through the throat this time. F***ck, I can finally die. After saying this, Joe died with an extremely satisfied expression on his face. For a while, the entire conch house was filled with an ominous silence. The players and the frogmen looked at each other for a while, before the silence was broken by Go Dan, unable to stifle his laughing anymore. Ha! Go Dan's reaction was quick, however, and he immediately acted as if nothing had happened, looking around at the scenery. Granted, there was nothing much to see in the room. Krakatoa looked at Go Dan with an appalled expression. This dry-skinned must have borrowed many salted fish from the one that died and was severely in debt, or else he wouldn't laugh after his own comrade died. He had guessed that these dry-skinned were acting dead to trick them, but Joe's chest and throat had definitely been impaled thoroughly by the spear, and his heartbeat and breathing had all stopped. From every sign, it was clear to see that he was dead, but Krakatoa felt as if something was wrong. "Fine, we accept your sincerity." Seeing that Go Dan was trying his hardest to hold in his laugh, Vela quickly talked with the village elder, trying to seal the deal. "Let's talk about how we should work together. Shouldn't you take care of your comrade's corpse first? The village elder asked, confused by the entire situation. Seeing his reaction, he already seemed open to the idea of working together with the players. After all, Joe had already sacrificed himself to prove their honesty, so he was scared that if he hesitated any more, the party of humans would all kill themselves in a heartbeat. Those enemies of the Society of the Secret Eye had already been a lot for the frogmen to handle, so if these humans that called themselves adventurers that could even kill themselves without any hesitation attacked them too, the frogman tribe would probably go instinct. That. Vela didn't know how to deal with Joe's corpse either. Was she supposed to tell them that the corpse of the players would naturally disappear after a day if no revival spell was cast on them? Why don't you unbind us and let us drag him out? Edward immediately spoke up, seeing this situation. It was actually alright to let the frogmen drag him out, but first of all Edward wanted to test out how much they cooperated with them, and second of all, they all really wanted to laugh. And so, Krakatoa took the conch spear that Joe had used to kill himself to cut the kelp around the players' wrists, unbinding them. Under the supervision of Krakatoa, the party dragged Joe's corpse out of the conch house, while Vela stayed in the room to converse with the village elder about how they should work together. Seeing that Krakatoa was there, the other frogmen didn't think much of the players' actions. Once Krakatoa went back to the conch house, Edward and Go-Dan burst out in laughter. Wahaha, Joe is such a dumb *SS. I almost died holding in my laughter. Ednl.co, don't laugh, he used his own life to pave the way to a peaceful future. Hahaha, sorry, I can't continue anymore, it's too funny. The merry laughter coupled with the brutally killed corpse attracted all the attention of all the frogmen in earshot. Chapter 66. Village Protection Quest. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. As Edward and the party were going to dispose of Joe's corpse, they all received a system notification at the same time. Ding! Unlocked Chain Side Quest, Frogman Guardian, Quest Description. After testing the Frogman tribe's battle power, the Society of the Secret Eye has planned to siege the village and destroy it in one strike. Heroes, help the Frogman village to protect their village against this attack. Quest Rewards. EXP, gain coins, proportional to enemies slain, randomized elite equipment coupon, and anything you can find in the Frogman village. Note: success of this quest will unlock the next quest, Frogman Guardian. Suddenly, Edward's expression became serious. Oh no! What is it? Go-Dan was confused. According to the system's habits, for it to activate such a mission means that the enemy is already on their way. After he said so, he looked around to see where the frogmen had hidden their equipment. At this time, Vela walked out of the conch house with a serious expression. Did you guys get that quest too? She asked the party, to which everyone nodded back at the same time. Did you tell the frogmen? Vaguely, but they don't seem to have put what I've said in mind. Even though it was hard to trust their combat power from their weapons, all their weapons including Krakatoa's spear were common, white equipment, and were the type of items that even the refugees didn't want. That being said, it was still extremely important to be prepared. If they could withstand an attack for 1 to 2 hours prepared, it would be a fluke to even be able to protect themselves for half an hour if they were taken off guard. What do we do now? Go-Dan asked worriedly. Let's go get our equipment first. Edward was silent in thought for a while, before turning over to Alina, who was silently eating candy at a side. Revive Joe, we need a warrior to tank damage and attract aggro of the enemies in battles of this scale. Alina nodded and stuck a lollipop into her mouth. Her hands that had become porcelain pale after becoming the Saintess in training waved in the air to create a golden magic circle. After that, the magic circle shattered like glass, turning into sparkling dust and flowing over to Joe's corpse. Joe twitched a few times before coming back to life. What happened? Did we succeed? The first thing Joe did upon waking up was open his quest list, checking on the work together with the Frogmen quest that they had accepted from Angora, and found that it had already been marked as completed. After he happily accepted the quest rewards, he realized that everyone's expression was strange. Did something happen? Joe asked carefully. The others looked at each other, before their gazes all fell on Go-Dan, who had the best relations with Joe. Go-Dan furrowed his brow, before telling Joe everything. Joe had been quite happy for clearing a quest, but upon hearing the news his expression became troubled. So you're saying? Joe looked at the other players in the party with a bitter expression. Not only did I miss a side quest because I was dead, but I have to risk my life to help you block the enemy's attacks. You're the only one who has class changed, so you can tank the most hits. Edward patted Joe's firm shoulder and continued, after the quest is complete, we'll give you half the game coins as compensation. Don't worry, those people from the Society of the Secret Eye can't even beat these frogmen, so they're probably weak. Go-Dan mirrored Edward's actions. Joe was about to say something, but Alina suddenly spoke up, careful, the frog is coming out. Everyone took a while to react, and the quickest was Vela, who immediately struck Joe's chest with her elbow, making him fall back onto the ground, half of his face covered with seawater. After quite some time of conversation within the village elder and Krakatoa, the frogman came out from the conch house at this moment. Seeing everyone crouching on the ground, Krakatoa croaked in confusion. Why are you all here? After that, his gaze shifted to Joe's body. I think I saw him move, is he? You were just seeing things. Vela took out a spiky conch from nowhere and used it to impale Joe's kidneys. Look. Would he be completely unresponsive if he were still alive? Seeing a bright red critical hit number pop out of Joe's head, the other players slowly inched away. I see. Krakatoa was intimidated by Vela's cold-blooded actions too. We frogmen twitch sometimes after we die too. Putting that aside. Vela pulled out the spiky conch again, which made another red number pop out of Joe's head, and threw it aside. Where are our weapons? Why are you all so concerned about your weapons? We, the wet-skinned, aren't that greedy. Krakatoa seemed offended. We just want to be prepared if an enemy appears. Making all precautions for every accident is our motto as adventurers. Edward made up a reason on the spot. Is that so? Krakatoa was still a little dubious, his expression still filled with contempt towards the players. Humph, I don't know why the village elder agreed to work together with you dry-skinned, but I, the great Krakatoa, do not trust you. As a warrior of the wet-skinned, I would sooner drown in the sea, before accepting your help. After he said so, he walked away, leaving the players looking at each other in confusion. What are you standing there for, don't you want your weapons? After waddling a few steps, Krakatoa turned around and asked the party. The party finally realized why the frogman had walked away mid-conversation, and followed behind him to get back their weapons. No matter what, they would need their weapons to stand their ground against the Society of the Secret Eye. After walking a few steps, Go-Dan felt something was wrong, before realizing that everyone forgot Joe on the seawater-flooded ground. Then, he walked back and tried to bring Joe, who was faking his death, together with them. That being said, Go-Dan was quite lithe and lean while Joe was bulky, so Go-Dan couldn't carry him princess-style nor on his back, so he could only drag his friend by his feet. And so, he dragged Joe into the distance by his feet, leaving behind a long trail of blood in the seawater that looked exceptionally desolate. Lo. Chapter 67. Saintis in Training. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Meanwhile, Shi-Wei was watching the show with a tub of popcorn. In comparison with the Rotten Bones Church, he was actually not so worried about the larger-scaled Society of the Secret Eye. The reason for this was simple: the Rotten Bones Church believed in a deity, with the support of the Rotten Bones god behind them. This meant that the main locations of the Rotten Bones Church were enveloped in the Rotten Bones God's divine energy, and unless Shi Wei was a couple stages higher than him, he wouldn't be able to see through the divine energy to perceive what the enemy was doing. But it was completely different with the Society of the Secret Eye. It was a smuggling organization with members from all around the continent, true, but that also meant that most of them believed in vastly different deities. This made it impossible for enough concentrated divine energy to prevent Shi Wei's observations. In short, no matter how secretive and how well guarded against spies they were, it would be completely useless in the eyes of Shi Wei. As long as it were a place that Shi Wei's believers conquered, then Shi Wei would be able to see every detail clearly. To Shi Wei, this organization was a piece of cake. This time too, he gave the players at the Frogman village a quest to forewarn them about the attack, upon seeing that the enemies had left their base and were heading towards the Frogman village. As for what happened later, he wasn't all that concerned about it. After all, the players would just revive at the unnamed town if they failed. With the underground hideout of Lancaster as a backup, the current starter village would be able to defend against the Society of the Secret Eye with no problems. Even if it were on the event that they lost terribly, Shi Wei would be able to descend to the mortal plane and wipe them out in one fell swoop. Again, it wasn't an organization with the support of a single deity, so no deity would come to him for retribution. In fact, after he updated the system and created the dungeon, he didn't give a lot of attention to the players on the mortal realm. Because other than that, he had much more pressing matters to attend to. The connections between deities of the same pantheon were closer than what Shi Wei had first thought. Even though the Rotten Bones God's deific properties haven't been completely destroyed, so the undead pantheon hadn't realized that their lackey had been killed by Shi Wei, but it was only a matter of time. BVEC Shi Wei was looking for a way to cut the connection between the Rotten Bones God and the undead pantheon, or at least prepare enough to be able to deal with what's to come if any deities from the pantheon wanted to look for trouble. The deity that came this time wouldn't be as easy to deal with as the Rotten Bones God, after all. Therefore, he needed a way to harvest more leaks, divine power. In conclusion, it was already stretching his limits to check in on the players from time to time, and he wouldn't waste his divine energy to help beat up little kids on the mortal realm. Frogman Village, Visitor's Suite, a conch house. The attack from the Society of the Secret Eye came a little slower than the party had expected, the scene still quite peaceful even after the party re-obtained their weapons from the frogmen. Did the system make a mistake? Or did it stop its bad habit of bullying them? Even Edward was doubting himself after such a long time. Thankfully, they were all firm in their belief of the god of games, most of them already reaching the level of devout believers and were on the cusp of becoming zealots. This was the reason why they quickly dispelled their own wavering hearts and strengthened their resolve, making them continue to lie in wait for the impending attack. I just thought of a problem. Go Dan dragged Joe, who had almost been drowned to death, onto a large, oval stone that the frogmen used as beds. As he tried to dry Joe, Go Dan continued in a low tone towards the others, if the Society of the Secret Eye wanted to attack the Frogman village, how would they do it? How would they do it? Well, just rush into the village and burn, and pillage. Upon saying this, Vela trailed off too. She realized that they all seemed to have gotten the wrong idea, which was that when they knew the Society of the Secret Eye was about to attack the Frogman village, they unconsciously equated them to regular bandits. Honestly, if it were a regular group of bandits, even if there were 70 to 80 of them, they wouldn't be a match for the 6 players in the party. After all, other than Vela, the other 5 in the party were the most experienced and strongest players of all. But, for an enemy to issue a quest, it would mean that the enemy obviously weren't regular bandits. This meant that any experience they had dealing with enemies of the sort had to be thrown out of the window. Which reminds me. As one of the 3 people that had been in the Society of the Secret Eye's hideout, Edward's expression darkened to a frown. I think there are magicians in the Society of the Secret Eye. The magicians that had strong, destructive long-ranged spells were definitely the most suited to siege an unsuspecting village. As if to prove his words correct, the ground started to rumble as if there were an earthquake, and even the seawater that was slightly shallower than outside ripples from the shock. The players all rushed out immediately. Perhaps it was for the sake of privacy, the frogmen built their village in a secluded corner of the tidal flats. The village faced the sea while the other side was up against steep cliffs, and on the other side of the cliffs was an endless expanse of land. Now, what Edward and party saw was a mudflow that rushed down the cliffs at a terrifyingly fast pace. The momentum and sheer magnitude of the mudflow was so large that most of the frogmen were petrified upon seeing it, their minds blank from shock. What the? Edward, you didn't tell us that the magicians from the Society of the Secret Eye were so powerful. Dan looked at the scary mudflow, his mind drawing a blank. No, that's not possible. I've never met a magician of that level when I was there. It was probably cast together by a group of magicians. Edward immediately rebutted the notion that there was such a strong magicians in the Society of the Secret Eye. After all, back when he snuck into the Society of the Secret Eye, other than a few outstanding ones, the others weren't strong at all. Shouldn't we run first? Vela shouted, already breaking out in a cold sweat. Even though they had become players that were virtually impossible to kill, and could even sacrifice their lives to create a chance for their allies against a strong enemy, their common sense and instincts still dictated that their first reaction was to flee upon being met with a natural disaster. We can't run from this, it's way faster than our speed on foot. Edward was dismayed by this turn of events. If he were max leveled, level 45, and had learned the strongest skills in their skill tree, perhaps he would be able to help, but even though he had the highest level within the players, he was only level 28. When he was faced with an attack of this magnitude, it was still too powerless. Here, help me carry this for a while. At this point, Elena, who had been silently eating a lollipop, sealed her candy packet, and stuffed it into Vela's hands. Ha! Vela looked at the silver-haired girl with a dubious expression, thinking that her way of thinking was a little odd. They were going to be buried by a mudflow, wasn't it a bad time to care about candy? Elena didn't know what Vela was thinking about, and took out her own weapon. As a higher-leveled player of the cleric class, Elena, who was a saintess in training, should have a weapon that clerics regularly used: hammers, shields, maces, or even a cross. Because Elena had only been focused on healing or casting a spear of victory occasionally, she had never held a weapon in her hands before. Hence, Vela guessed that the girl hadn't found a weapon that was suited for her yet. But in actuality, Elena had her own weapon. It was a hardcover book that had been attached at her hip using a silver chain that seemed like an accessory of a priest's robe, and was locked tight with a metal lock. This book was named the Game Bible, and white metal was attached onto its corners, and was basically a rectangular mace that had 8 spikes. Even though it seemed to be able to deal a lot of damage in battle, it didn't look like it could help with the current situation. Sacred Barrier. The girl dragged the chain and used it to swing the large book, before using the momentum to swing it into the distance. The next moment, a large, pale blue barrier erected from where the book dropped onto the ground. At the center of the barrier was a white cross, and in the 4 partitions that it separated were pictures resembling a sword, a mage's staff, a bow, an arrow, and finally the picture of a holy book. At the center of the cross was the emblem of the god of games. This barrier was so large that it covered the entire Frogman village and even far beyond, and it was so tall it reached the heavens. The mudflow that had been flowing down the cliff with such force struck the barrier and was cut off immediately, not even making a ripple in the barrier. Are you kidding me? Vela was in complete shock. She knew of the skill Sacred Barrier because it was a defensive skill that clerics could learn at level 15, which could summon a barrier of light. The barriers that regular clerics could summon were the height of a single person and were around 2 meters in length, which was why the light barrier in front of her shocked her so much. It was at this point that she remembered what Edward said earlier: don't judge a book by its cover, Miss Vela. If it were just in terms of battle power, she's probably the strongest of us all. She had thought it was a joke back then, but they weren't joking in the least. Vela wasn't the only one that was shaken by the large barrier of light. Upon seeing the twin-tailed silver-haired girl block the attack that they had resigned themselves to dying to, they all knelt down on the ground and started muttering in frogman language that the players couldn't understand, before prostrating themselves and hitting their heads towards the ground, as if they had misunderstood the young girl as some strange existence. Chapter 68. The Magician's Trump Cards. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. The scene of an entire village's worth of frogmen kneeling for her was too much for a young girl of her age, and Alina looked at the scene in front of her helplessly. Hakuna Macroa Croak. The frogmen didn't seem to know that their actions troubled the young girl, and continued to mutter in a language that they couldn't understand as they worshipped her. What are they saying? Edward helped up Krakatoa, that was about to kneel down too, and asked in confusion. O great aquatic lord, we offer you our most sincere worship and respect in gratitude for your protection and your blessings that let us relish in the gifts of the sea. We shall never forget your benevolence, and shall the water be with us always. Krakatoa translated quickly. You said such a long sentence with a few croaks. Godan felt that something was wrong. This only proves that our language is more advanced than yours. Krakatoa replied with pride. Kid, I think you're quite suited to learn our language, why don't I teach you? The players didn't hesitate in the slightest, and shook their heads at the same time. At this point, another commotion started in the frogmen again. What are they saying? Edward asked. Krakatoa listened for a few moments, before his expression became panicked. It's the dry-skinned. They're rushing down from the mountains. Edward looked at the others, realizing that the real deal was about to come. Albert was a magician that belonged to the Society of the Secret Eye. Different than the mage players that were supported by the system, he was a native magician of this world. The title of magician was far out of reach for commoners, and was much more mysterious than nobles and aristocrats, and many commoners even thought that their position in society was higher than nobles too. That was the case, after all. A player that could surpass the level of apprentice magician and could become a fully fledged caster could obtain status equal to a baron. BDNVLM. That being said, it was exceptionally hard to become even stronger for them. In this world that was filled with deities, the position of a regular mage was quite awkward. Even though magic was mysterious and had an extremely high limit for its power. If learned correctly, casters could emulate many effects of sacred arts, and could even cast ones with even stronger effects. This point could be seen from the fact that a third of the legendary champions were magicians. The rest were clerics, and there weren't any warriors, but that wasn't all there was to being a magician. First of all, potential was extremely important in learning how to cast spells. If a person didn't have any potential for magic and couldn't feel the mana in the atmosphere, it was of no use even if they were geniuses. First of all, the study of magic was extremely profound, and it was difficult to even get started without the help of a mentor. Learning theory and the basics were extremely important, and most could only claim to know magic after 3 years of practice casting spells and 5 years of meditation, along with multitudes of magical experiments. These were all indispensable to the discovery of the core of magic, and so it was hard to learn magic if an individual had the talent, but not the brains for it. All in all, it was hard for a person to remain committed to learning magic. Fun fact, the magicians had their own deity that they worshipped, the most mysterious existence among the 7 divine fathers, Magic Violet. This deity was different from the others in the fact that he had never actively recruited any worshippers, and didn't need the belief of followers, and had never given any oracles to his believers. In a way, he was similar to Lord Hades, who was a divine father too. In contrast to the terrifying Lord Hades, Magic Violet didn't have much of a presence, and there wasn't even evidence in the mortal realm that this deity had existed. If it weren't for the fact that there were priests and gifted humans from large-scale churches that could communicate with the gods and could confirm that this deity took up one of the positions of Divine Father, humans would probably not know that he existed. There were two main theories that the magicians had about this deity currently. The first was that Magic Violet created all magic and defined the existence of magic, so as long as there were casters on this world, he wouldn't disappear. The second was that Magic Violet created a web of magic that humans couldn't detect. According to this theory, all magic that existed in this world were all his divine energy, and whenever someone used magic, it meant that they had expressed their belief in him. Therefore, as long as magic existed, he would never disappear. Whichever the case was, it was an undisputed fact that for one to be able to change the laws of an entire world, Magic Violet was completely qualified to be on equal standing with the other divine fathers. Long story short, learning magic required vast amounts of knowledge, information and materials, and all these things could be reduced to a simple factor: money. It was because of the generous rewards that Albert chose to join the Society of the Secret Eyes Vala Empire branch, completing various tasks in exchange for money in some rare materials. Now, he was faced with a somewhat troublesome mission, which was to attack the Frogman village. He had joined the first experimental siege on the Frogman village, but he didn't personally attack them, instead collecting data of the village from a side as the other attacked. According to the information and data obtained from that attack, Albert had the preparation to destroy the village in one blow. Initially, he had thought that a mudflow was more than enough. The creation of a mudflow was simple: use explosions to break the cliff and create a mudflow. This move was easy and practical, and other than choosing the blast points, there wasn't much effort to do this. Even so, he still used a large amount of flame flowers as explosives, and even though these flowers were the cheapest fire attribute magic materials, it still cost him quite a lot of Ryans. After all, who gave those frogmen the confidence to build their village by a cliff? He hadn't expected there to be someone that was as strong as a bishop in the Frogman village that was able to create such a large barrier to intercept it. TCH, why didn't such a strong fellow appear last time? Albert looked anxiously at the sacred barrier that was slowly disappearing down below, and didn't even notice when he bit his lips so much that it drew blood. If he knew that an enemy of this level were there, he wouldn't have chosen such a way to attack. This isn't good. If I go back like this, Black Whip is never going to forgive me. Albert's heart was filled with fear upon the thought of that malicious and terrifying man. Now that it comes down to this, I can only use my trump cards. Albert frustratedly took out a scroll from his bag, before ripping it to shreds without even looking at it. The next moment, a few tall figures in black armor appeared on horses around him. Damn it, this Rhine Knight summoning scroll cost me 1 gold abbey. Albert ordered the figures around him with a pained expression. Listen to my command. Go and kill all the life you see down there. The captain of the Rhine Knights nodded and saluted stiffly, before the troop rushed down the cliff. Faint shouts could be heard from the bottom of the cliff. It's the dry-skinned. They're rushing down from the mountains. Chapter 69. The Dark Knights. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Go Dan was the first to realize that something was wrong with the black armored knights that were rushing towards the village. Something's not right, my vital shot skill failed. These aren't humans. Has anyone learned detect? Use it to see who those are. Edward commanded, but was met with the party's lost expressions. F***CK, did none of you learn it? We followed Mr. Marnie in Mr. Ivan's team, and they're extremely experienced with detect. Go Dan muttered in retaliation. With them, who would waste skill points to learn that? It was true that other than people like Marnie that were experienced and knowledgeable, the people of this world were mostly fed up of feeling helpless and weak. Hence, it was normal for them to want to learn skills that could be used in battle in comparison to ones that weren't as useful in battle. Elena, can you cast your sacred barrier again? Edward asked the young girl. It's still on cooldown. Elena shook her head, which made her silver twin tails swing around in the air with the movement, and was extremely cute. So the cooldown became longer in exchange for its strength, That I don't know whether these enemies are susceptible to taunting. Is Joe awake? Edward could only make up a backup plan on the spot, asking Go Dan next to him. I'm coming. I don't know why I had 2 holes on my hip, and I spent some time drinking HP potions. Before Go Dan could reply, Joe ran over, fully equipped. My grandma said that I can bleed, but I can't lose my kidneys. Wait, didn't this dry-skinned already die? Krakatoa's eyes that were much larger than a human's widened even further, and stared straight at Joe who had come back to life. Don't fret, do you know about the last spurt before fully dying? Vela quickly explained. That's what this is. Are you dry-skinned so active before you die thoroughly? Krakatoa looked up and down at Joe, his expression dubious. It's like that for everyone. Vela reassured. Don't worry, he'll die soon. Humans are scary. Krakatoa didn't know what to think, and could only exclaim, but to think that such a brave warrior sacrificed himself for a simple misunderstanding. The great Krakatoa feel sa. Before Krakatoa could finish his sentence, Joe felt the frogman's gaze on him, and held up his middle finger in his direction with a bright smile. Krakatoa. How much longer do you guys want to talk? Jessica asked in panic. Those guys are here. The line of defense that the frogmen had created in their haste couldn't defend against the enemy's charge, and was broken in a flash. Even the conch houses that had been blocking the enemy's path were shattered without much resistance. Get away, let me do it. Joe stuck his sword in the ground, before making a taunting action towards the Dark Knights. Hey, come to daddy, kiddos. There was a single red eye that shone from within the helmets of the Dark Knights, which turned to Joe's direction upon hearing his taunting. Then, the course of the Dark Knight's charge curved slightly, changing their trajectory to charge towards Joe. Oh, taunting works on them. Joe had just finished his sentence before he was sent flying by the Dark Knights, not even managing to summon a familiar spirit in time. His body twisted in midair before he stopped to the ground with a squelch, as if he were a dirty rag that was filled with water. Surprisingly enough, he didn't die from the impact. Gah, that scared me. Joe crawled up shaking as if he had Parkinson's. The armor on his body was filled with cracks because of the impact from earlier, and even if he didn't open up his equipment page, he knew that the durability of this suit of armor that he had equipped for the longest time had been reduced to 0, and couldn't be fixed even by the blacksmiths of the starter village. I'm a little pissed off, Edward. There are 5 enemies, so other than Vela let's take one each, what do you think? Joe stroked his armor in mourning, before speaking with Edward in dissatisfaction. Sure, if you can separate them. Edward had noticed that although the Dark Knights were quite aggressive and scary, and their levels were around level 20, they did not seem to have supernatural powers. According to the judgment of the system, if a player were attacked by a supernatural attack that had effects of magic, sacred arts or even curses attached to them, players would receive additional elemental damage. To most players, elemental damage was quite enfeebling because their defenses against those were weak, and there weren't many equipment that could defend against those early on in the game. Now, looking back at this strong charge attack by the Dark Knights, because it was just a basic physical attack, there was no difference between this attack and a simple swing of a sword by a player. Basically, the players could defend against their attacks with their own stats and equipment, and after many damage recalculations, they wouldn't get hurt much. And so, these Dark Knights that seemed impossible to defend against could only be classified as elite monsters when compared to bosses like the Rotten Bones Archbishop. No problem, I have a plan. Joe glanced at the Dark Knights that had slowed down to curve, and was about to charge into him again. As he was about to tell Edward his wonderful, well-founded strategy that could be used to take up 5,000 words in this novel, a feminine voice rang out in the air. Sacred Barrier. Elena, who had taken the chance to get back her Mac, the game Bible, swung the book again, and threw it in the direction of the Dark Knight like a hammer throw athlete. The next moment, a sky-blue barrier of light appeared in front of the Dark Knights that had finally gotten enough momentum for another charge. The dark knights that couldn't stop in time crashed into the sacred barrier that the young saintess in training cast, and after making a dull noise, they and their mounts were crumpled into a can of Spam. Upon seeing the majestic dark knights getting wiped out without any hurrah, the frogmen couldn't wrap their heads around what they were seeing. Meanwhile, Joe had the regretful expression of someone who didn't have the chance to waste words in this novel. Go-Dan walked over and patted his shoulder on tiptoe. "Don't be depressed, it's time to deal with the root of the problem," Edward said beside him. The root of the problem. Vela, who had sighed in relief, got worried again. "Yeah, don't you see that the quest isn't complete yet?" Edward speculated. "I'm afraid that the leader of this attack against us is still on the cliffs. We better hurry before he does anything else." Chapter 70. Humans are awesome. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. By the time the party arrived at the cliff, there was already no one there. "Welp, we're gonna fail this mission." Joe carried his great sword on his shoulder and continued regretfully, "The guy who hid here earlier already fled." Krakatoa, that had been rushing the fastest, had finally managed to catch up with the party, panting and kneeling on the ground and feeling as if he were going to dry out in the next moment. Then, he looked at Joe, who didn't have any visible signs of exhaustion, and started to doubt himself. He was the greatest warrior in the Frogman tribe, but he couldn't even be compared with a human that was going to die. And according to what he heard them say, this human called Joe had just become a warrior. So what kind of monsters were these humans? There are no traces on the ground, and although it's not impossible that he had escaped, but just in case. Edward looked towards Go-Dan. Go-Dan immediately knew what the former wanted him to do and squatted down on the ground, starting to create an orb the size of a ping-pong ball in his hands. Upon seeing this, the other players all covered their ears, leaving Krakatoa confused. The next moment, Go-Dan stood up and clammed the orb into the ground. Suddenly, a deafening boom sounded out as the orb exploded, and the sound was so loud that the party even saw sound waves vibrating in the air. This skill was called a Sonic Boom Orb, which was an extension of the 100 Hunting skill series that was unique to the Ranger class. In short, the skill was one that could be used to create orbs in response to different hunting situations, and other than the Sonic Boom Orb, there were die balls, poop orbs and flash bombs, and more. Because Rangers could also make explosives the height of half a human to build traps, the players from the other classes called this skill the fourth dimensional pocket of the Rangers. Players don't have an inventory to store their items, and could only carry those with them, because Shiwei couldn't create storage space for them out of thin air. Other than attracting the attention of enemies from afar, it could also cause a petrified status for whoever wasn't prepared, and could even shake out the earthworms in the ground. Now it seems that the skill was quite effective, because other than Krakatoa, who had been stunned and fell onto the ground like a real big frog, another guy was blasted out from underground. This magician from the Society of the Secret Eye seemed to have used some magic spell to make the soil like liquid, and to him, the originally solid earth turned into a wide and calm ocean where he could sneak into and hide. Unfortunately, this plan that he thought was foolproof was still solved by Go-Dan. The power of the Sonic Boom Orb was definitely strong, and he was so scared that he couldn't even maintain his magic, leaving half of his body stuck underground. Looking at the players that were coming towards him with an evil glint in their eyes, Albert broke out in a cold sweat and smiled bitterly. Is it too late now to surrender? Because they wanted to learn useful information from Albert, Edward and the party didn't decide to kill Albert on the spot. That being said, when they caught him and dragged him out of the ground and left him with just a pair of boxers, the system judged that they had succeeded the first stage of the Frogman Guardian quest, and immediately issued the next stage in the quest series. The second stage was simple, which was to let the party go back to seek aid from the players back at the starter village. Once Albert, the strong magician, failed to report back to them, the Society of the Secret Eye would definitely attack the Frogman village with greater forces, and even use all of their resources in the Vala Empire branch to do so. Basically, it was unrealistic to block the next wave of attack by the Society of the Secret Eye with just 6 players and some incompetent frogmen. The players that arrived at the village and joined the defense against the Society of the Secret Eye would all get corresponding rewards. The players huddled together, discussing how to deal with the following events. We would probably need 1 day to get back to the unnamed town and back to the Frogman village, and who knows when the Society of the Secret Eye is going to attack again. Edward analyzed calmly. If we don't get back here in time, then the village is going to be destroyed without question. Therefore, most of us have to stay, while only 1 or 2 of us go to seek help. Let me do it, I'll set out immediately. Vela took up the mission without any hesitation. I'm the weakest within everyone here, after all, and I wouldn't be much help. Leave this sort of mission to me. The unnamed town had been attacked by revenants not long ago, and Vela, who hadn't even believed in the god of games back then, would never forget the hope that bloomed in her heart upon seeing the players save them. And now, it was time to bring hope to this frogman village that didn't even know how to speak. All right, then. Edward nodded, and Vela set off for the unnamed town immediately. Also, I have an idea. After Vela left, Edward continued talking with the other players. What plan? Jessica asked curiously. Make the frogmen believe in the god of games, and turn them into players too. This suggestion made the others look at the others in doubt. This would be quite hard, wouldn't it? Go Dan asked unsurely. The frogmen definitely have their own god, or else why would they worship Alina as someone sent by their lord? So we just tell Alina that their deity changed his name. Edward continued without any hesitation. Their deity didn't lend a hand to save them in the first place, and it's great to believe in the god of games. After that, he paused, and continued, also, we can get rewards from the regular quest and get a little more EXP rewards. Go Dan and Jessica. Hey, isn't that his real motive? On the other side, Joe felt that it was hard to follow up with the conversation because he wasn't that smart, and so he just sat at a side and ate grilled salted fish. Even though the salted fish made by the frogmen looked ugly, but because they lived by the sea, all the ingredients used were caught fresh, and resulted in the salted fish having a delectable and even fresh taste. Warrior, can you still eat? Krakatoa waddled over and sat next to Joe, looking at the young man that was eating fish with no problem as if he had grown a third eye. Joe, who had no idea that the misunderstanding hadn't been solved, thought the frogman didn't have any appetite because he was worried about the upcoming battle. Why not? It's times like this when you have to fill up your tummy. Joe exclaimed, himself a firm believer on not battling on an empty stomach. I see, so you don't want to pass away with an empty stomach. Krakatoa stared at Joe pitifully, which made the latter quite uncomfortable. How much longer can you live? Joe was stunned by this question. Didn't they say that the players were allied with the frogmen? Why did this guy want him to die so much? But then, he came up with a reason by himself. Krakatoa's Shimonian sounded quite weird, so perhaps it's just a grammatical error caused by him not learning the language well. Maybe he was asking about how long the lifespan of a human was. Maybe 60 or 70 more years. Joe replied nonchalantly. You dry-skinned, humans can live another 60 years like this. Krakatoa was completely stunned by the revelation. Well, it's probably 30 to 40 years before, but now that I believed in the god of games, my life is probably going to be longer. Joe sighed in awe. Then you can even get a wife and children. Krakatoa exclaimed. Humans can last so long after finally dying. Yeah, of course, and maybe even get grandchildren too. Joe didn't know what Krakatoa meant by the second half of his exclamation, but he still said proudly. Krakatoa sat there in awe, before he finally croaked out. Humans are awesome.